you a snippet of my publication entitled Scripturalizing Revelation, an African American Post-Colonial Reading of Empire. And what I'd like to do is just share with you the introduction chapter, read to you a snippet of the introduction chapter that explains what my work attempts to do. This study of the book of Revelation examines John the Seer's rhetorical strategy in general and his use of imperial cult ritual in the heavenly throne room scenes in particular through the lens of an African American biblical interpretation that is framed by the concepts of signifying, a la Henry Louis Gates Jr., cultural memory, and supplemented by post-colonial theory. The purpose of the reading is to unveil the complex cultural negotiations involved in the construction of a Christian identity. The scripting will propose that John the Seer's signifying on empire demonstrated that he was well aware of the oppressive nature of Roman imperialism on the lives of provincial Asian Christians. This is made evident throughout the text by his fierce, non-accommodating stance towards participation in imperial cult ritual. Yet, ironically, John reinscribed imperial processes and practices in his resistance strategy. Seemingly, no matter how determined he was in his persuasion to disconnect the Christian communities from the religio-political manipulations of empire, his hybrid identity disallowed him. John's colonized construction as almost the same but not quite like has resulted in the production of a resistance strategy that is a blurred copy of the hegemonic tactics of the Roman Empire that entail violent disruption and displacement. And I show this through a close reading of Revelation and looking, for example, at chapters 2. In chapters 2, John uses he's misogynistic in his language and his treatment to the prophet Thyatira, or his language in chapter 12 and 14 in the whore of 18, the whore of Babylon. Throughout this entire text, we do see a close reading when it comes to women in the text. We see how his language is oppressive, abusive, very much in tune with the tactics of the prevailing Roman society. Also, in chapters 3 in particular, in the messages of the church to Philadelphia and Smyrna, for example, he is an advocate of social inequality. When he speaks of the message to Smyrna in Philadelphia through a very close reading, we can see that these people, these folks in this community, are not treated as equals, because in his language it's, you will worship my God. You will never go out of the temple of my God. You will be a servant. In the ancient world, there were temple slaves who never went out of the temple. They held the temple, they held the structure up. They were the pillars of the society because their slave labor held up that community, held up the empire. We also see in the letters of Smyrna, as a contrast to this social status, that it's a rich community, even though they're lukewarm because they're forgetting they're rich but they're poor, he says. But in the exhortation part of that letter, he speaks of, but if you repent or if you conquer, another language of empire, this constant language of conquering, you will sit at the same table with me, beside my Father and myself on his throne. So there, when you do that close analysis of these, in juxtaposition of these two messages, once to Philadelphia and to Smyrna, you see that this social inequality is not going to be equal status in the New Jerusalem through a close reading. In chapter 19, Jesus is a war god. His final metamorphosis, when Jesus finally appears, right, he comes as one that's clothed in blood, with a name that you can never know. He's on a white horse, that white horse that we heard of in chapter 4, which was so dangerous when it's the 4 horsemen. But yet Jesus appears on that white horse in chapter 19, very much doing the same work of a conquering emperor. So this is where I say that even though John is so resistant against the oppressive nature of empire, through a close reading of his rhetoric, we can see that he actually reinscribes or mimics empire. I argue that John's mimicry of the ideological assumptions and methods of constructing empire is due, to a certain degree, to his being a member of society that demanded participation in the rituals of empire. Ritual performance caused participants to connect with imperial codes, implicitly and explicitly, that in turn modified their behavior. In addition, it is suggested in my work that John's denial of his own ambivalent hybrid construction, his repression or non-realization of his own fragmentation, his own double consciousness, may be the cause for his contradictory stance towards empire. So what I'm arguing here is that he is so much in the system that his way out of the system is merely duplicating what the system does. That's his answer to, he's just reversing. He's not really changing the way that the system is constructed. He's not breaking that down. He's just displacing the people in those positions. He's putting his community in the place of the Roman Empire and putting in the binary construction and putting the Roman Empire at the bottom of the binary. He's just flipped the script, in other words, and he's using the same tactics. So this reading of Revelation, fused with post-colonial theory, is directed to the African American community as a warning of the potential danger of reinscribing the oppressive elements of the American ethos. This is not to say that my work advocates a post-liberation or a post-racial sentiment, that the two great beasts of society, racism and sexism, are no longer threats to a holistic and affirming society. What my reading does maintain, however, is that African American biblical scribes must speak to the community's vulnerability to the subtle ways of the beast by addressing a fuller scope of the complexity of African American identity. The task of the African American biblical scribe in the 21st century and beyond is to open the eyes of the community to the challenges and pitfalls involved in accommodating to a social, political, and economic system that is founded on social inequality, exploitation, and an unfair distribution of wealth. I suggest that African American biblical scribes must continue to expose the community to what lurks in the darkness by challenging and provoking the dominant system, but also to become more diligent in exposing how the community adopts and adheres to the oppressive elements of the dominant culture. In this way, scholars will better represent the inherent ambivalence of African American identity. It is this potential danger of feeding the imperial beast that serves as my motivation to produce an African American reading of the Book of Revelation that addresses the broader issues, concerns, and challenges that the African American community must encounter and overcome in the 21st century and beyond. So that's just that's a snippet of to give you an example of what the book does. And as I said, in the exegesis chapter of the book, I go in and do a very detailed, close reading of all the chapters of Revelation, laying out and comparing just how John's language is indeed a mimicry. He's doing both. He's mimicking and he's mocking. What I mean by signifying on empire, that's a Henry Louis Gates term. It's also an African American term. I don't know if you know what signifying is. So signifying on empire, John's signifying is performed by, Revelation has very hidden language, encoded language, right? He never directly speaks against the Roman Empire per se. He always couches it in coded language such as Babylon, right? He looks to the past. He doesn't really bring it into the present. So you have to decode John. And with that decoding of John, you see that that's signifying in our community. He's talking in indirect terms. His rhetoric is indirection. It's hidden. And it's our job to decode his coded language. So that's the signifying aspect. We realize that John is really, even though he puts this in very esoteric, otherworldly language, John is very much situated in his first century context. He's speaking against the Roman Empire and the oppressiveness against these colonized Asian Christians. But the work explores that, exposes that in that signifying, nevertheless, he's unconscious that he's doing the same thing to his community, because if his community does not adhere to what he proposes, everybody's going to hell, right? Jesus will come back and get you too, in the same manner as he's going to come back and get the Roman oppressors, right? And I argue that because of his ambivalence, because of his if it's unconscious or conscious, I want to say that it's unconscious in my work. That, and some scholars will dispute that John is doing it, it's a very conscious, he's aware of what he's doing. But I say it's unconscious, because I want to bridge that over to African American identity. Are we conscious in our ambivalence? Do we recognize that even though we are very much a liberative, in a liberative framework, that we unconsciously show that we are still part of the system? Thank you, my time is up. I got my
Good morning. Unlike my colleagues, I have not written a book, but I have 3 articles that I'd like to share with you very briefly. But before I do that, I want to, as my colleague did, share my appreciation for Dr. Handy for sponsoring this. And I want to say a special word to Dr. McQuarrie. I appreciate her opening us up by sharing with us moral philosophy that is more than 250 years old, because it is a reminder that we are in a tradition, and the students who are sitting out before us will continue that tradition of writing and sharing our knowledge. I have written both for the church and the academy, and the first article is printed in a magazine for the Presbyterian Church. It's called the Presbyterian Mission Agency, Mission Crossroads. And the article is written primarily for denominational executives who are trying to get an understanding on what it is that the church is called to do and be in the 21st century as we engage in mission. The article is entitled Navigating 21st Century Church Mission Education, Transforming Mission Locally and Globally. And as we all know, our experiences in the United States around the whole issue of mission has not always been one that we can appreciate. There are people in the dominant culture who recognize the importance of mission, and whether they are doing it right or wrong, they are engaging in mission. And there are persons from other marginal communities in our church who want to engage in mission. They feel that it's part of our identity as Christians, yet because of the prostitution of the gospel and the dehumanizing way that many people of African descent were exposed to the gospel, there is some ambiguity. So this article is written to help us understand that we have an obligation to engage in mission, but we don't have to repeat those dehumanizing methods. And again, if we think simply of the Protestant church in the West, but if we look at the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for example, or churches in other parts of the world, we will find that mission is at the heart of their identity, and they do it in non-oppressive ways. The second essay that I'd like to share with you is in a book entitled To Be One in Christ Intercultural Formation and Ministry. And my essay is entitled A Theology of Intercultural Competence Toward the Reign of God. And in this article, I am investigating the whole question of what does it mean to produce an intercultural competent student. That is a student who knows, has a great sense of him herself, and is able to engage the world, contributing the gifts, the perspectives, the thoughts that we bring to the ministry. The third article is presented in a book entitled Evangelical Interfaith Dialogue. It is presented by Fuller Theological Seminary. It's called Mission and Dialogue, Critical Conversations for a Global Church. And there's one article in particular I'd like to highlight. It's called Theological Education in the Urban Context, Engaging the Children of Anawa, Sarah, and Hagar. And this article can be found in its entirety at www.fuller.edu/EIFD, Evangelical Interfaith Dialogue. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs. It says, this essay argues not only is interfaith engagement an invaluable form of Christian mission wherever Christians and other faith communities live together and share common social and geographical space, but it is also perhaps one of the most valued forms of Christian mission operable within dynamic multi-religious urban contexts in North America. And in this particular article, I talk about my 20 years of teaching religions of the world here at the ITC. And the article continues, located approximately 5 minutes from the ITC in southwest Atlanta, Georgia, is the West End, a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious community that often serves as a dynamic living classroom without walls for courses in missiology, evangelism, and religions of the world. It is often acknowledged that the defining characteristic of the West End is its wide array of religious institutions, from the historic West Hunter Street Baptist Church to an old-fashioned spiritual reader, to the Shrine of the Black Madonna Cultural Center and bookstore of the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church. For at least 15 years, the West End community has played a significant role in providing ITC students with a dynamic learning context to discover and practice what it means to be a Christian leader with interfaith competence in religiously dynamic communities. Students of ITC engage the following religious faith communities. The first one I identify is the Children of Anawa, and that represents African indigenous believers. Anawa is a mythical woman representing Africa and the continental values of love and respect for life and of people and nature. The second group I call the Children of Sarah in terms of Judaism. This represents the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, sometimes referred to as the Hebrew Israelites or the Black Jews, and they are very active in urban cities of the United States. The next group is called the Children of Sarah, represented by Christianity. Diverse Christian congregations have had a long and active presence in the West End. And then lastly, the Children of Hagar, represented in the religion of Islam. The West End Islamic Center, known as the Community Masjid, has functioned for more than 25 years, dedicated to the establishment of Islam in the West. A very key component of ITC's theological education is the developing of an intercultural competence among students that is holistic, multidisciplinary, and integrated, and honors missiology with a bifocal concern for both mission as evangelism and mission as dialogue with religions of the world. And this is simply to say that I think this is one of the most exciting periods in history for us to be shaping and forming religious leaders. It's not the easiest, but especially because of religious pluralism. I often tell the students that This is not an issue that their pastors or their grandparents had to deal with, but this is an issue for students who are preparing as minister leaders today. What does it mean for us to live in a religiously diverse community? Thank you.